open it up right now to some thoughts and questions. I know it's exactly 7 o'clock, so if you cannot stay, that is totally okay. I will follow up with you over email if you have any questions. But for now, if you want, you can put in any of your thoughts or questions on the presentation. And I'd love it if you stay and give us feedback as well, because that's the next slide as well. So yeah, open to questions now. Sorry if I spoke too fast. And you can do that through the poolev.com/youthvmbc platform. Or if it's, yes, your emails will get sent, the slides will get sent through the emails that you registered with. Okay, as a newcomer, one big challenge is not having connections and networks. What do you recommend to solve that? That's a really good question. So I think yeah, it's okay if you don't already have sort of connections. I would recommend sort of going to these websites and looking for opportunities through that, and then also reaching out to organizations and sort of slowly building your network that way. Just sending a quick email, being like, I'm a newcomer youth, I'm really interested in getting involved. These volunteer centers are definitely your starting point. You can also, there are also like newcomer centers. So the Center for Education and Training, for example, is one that exists in, I know, in the Peel region, and they do a lot of support in helping newcomers get connected to a network. I also recommend joining these different Facebook groups. You might be able to like see and meet people through those. Those are just some ideas. But yeah, I know it's definitely tricky and it will take time. Okay, what kinds of volunteer opportunities? So specifically, like I said earlier, it's not, if you're a newcomer, I'm sure there are still ways for you to help by looking on these different sites around opportunities available. You know, just because you're a newcomer doesn't mean you can't participate in any of these opportunities that are out there. They're just as relevant to you as any other ones. If they're like language based, maybe it would be a little bit more challenging, but you can always like, and maybe if your English skills are not, you're not fully comfortable yet, you can always like let the volunteer coordinator know that, and they can always support you in that way. But I don't have any like very specific, like if you're a newcomer, you must volunteer for this. It's the same process as everybody else. And then Sean, if you also want to jump in on any questions. Okay, this is a great question. Wow. Okay, so for the previous presentation, someone mentioned the no's they receive were sometimes due to another initiative that were already in place. So I think, you know, in the volunteer sector, like especially when you're starting youth-led initiatives, it's quite common for things to be replicated, and people want to starting something similar. So it's okay that, you know, maybe there is something that is already in place. There's always opportunities to collaborate. Don't ever feel like it's competition, right? It's not, we're all trying to support society. We're not a business. We're not trying to compete with each other. So maybe there's opportunities for you to actually collaborate or like have a chapter of that initiative in your community, because oftentimes an initiative might exist like in the Peel region, but it doesn't exist in like Vancouver. So maybe there's ways you can learn lessons from each other and launch it where you are. So I would only justify starting your own initiative if it makes sense that that specific thing doesn't exist in the community, or the initiative that exists maybe is at capacity and they need support in expanding, and you can sort of serve that by starting something similar where you are.
I think it's perfect. Oh, and Nabila, I don't know if I can jump in there.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Because I guess part of the question is whether, I'm sorry, I think I'm getting feedback. I'm just thinking that earphones back in again. Hello? Okay, I think this is better. So I kind of have some experience with, you know, I don't know, just to answer that question. So when we had started the Pen Pal initiative, I had identified that there wasn't really a Pen Pal initiative or a similar project going on in my own community. I had done a little bit of research. I didn't find anything. So that is why I did start my own, and specifically a virtual one, because I did do some research and there were pen pal initiatives in other areas, not in my own. But I kind of identified the barriers that would have been present in those. And so that's why I took a virtual approach and started my own. But as we went on, actually, when I first initiated this in my own community, a couple of my friends contacted me and actually expressed that, well, my one friend had been thinking of starting a pen pal initiative of her own, but hadn't put it into motion. So she contacted me, and basically we talked about, how to get it started. I provided her with some resources, and just talked her through how I went about contacting homes, etc. And then my other friend too had seen what I was doing in the community, and then how Eliza and I were building the initiative, and he wanted to start one in his own community as well. So we actually had two kind of offshoot. Well, I guess one, she was going to start it anyway, but we had an offshoot of our own initiative too in another area, which is fabulous.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that insight. So I want to quickly address some of these other questions, and you're welcome to pipe in as well. If you have very little volunteer experience or haven't volunteered in several years, I don't think it will be difficult to necessarily get a position. Because for the most part, like when I was applying to different volunteer organizations, it was less about the experience I had, more about like what I brought to the table, and really being able to communicate that I was really passionate about the program. So for example, I've never worked with seniors. And when I did this telephone reassurance program, although I had no experience with working with seniors, I told them that, like it was something I was really interested in. I have worked with youth before. It's a little bit different, but I'm really excited to learn. So I think showing an openness to that should not sort of be a hindrance to you getting an opportunity without having like loads and loads of volunteer experience. Because volunteering is about getting experience. Although some more advanced roles maybe would require a little bit more experience. So it's always something you have to ask the organization too. So someone asked, yeah, actually that's a really good question about like how long each of your involved is for. And I forgot to mention, I really recommend thinking about volunteering as like a long-term investment. You can always do these smaller opportunities where you're writing letters and doing these things, but like, for me, it was really important to find things where I could dedicate at least a couple months. So some of my involvements were definitely shorter. A lot of the ones that I mentioned today are ongoing. So I got involved in maybe like May or April or June for some of them, and I'm still involved. And my volunteer commitment has changed and I communicated that once I started working for Volunteer NBC. So I would say at least a couple months. Or each of those involvements. Like I've been involved with the magazine for a couple months now, the research position for a couple months. So I definitely think about opportunities from like at least be willing to commit 3 to 4 months if you can. And people really appreciate that time commitment. Yeah. So is joining an initiative looked down upon in comparison to starting one? Definitely not. I think all these initiatives that you start, I think you should only start an initiative if it makes sense for you. Don't start one for the sake of starting one. You start one because something didn't exist. You start one because it makes sense to you. You're really passionate about it. For the most part, joining an initiative maybe should be the first goal. And sometimes joining an initiative allows you to recognize what the gaps are and then can help you and start a new one. So I wouldn't jump to starting a new one just because it seems like the right thing to do. But you can definitely do like smaller things like that fundraiser I ran, or if you're running like smaller things, like I think that's a little bit of a simpler way of starting an initiative rather than trying to do a big project right off the get-go if you don't have a ton of experience. So quickly answering, so lots of questions. Thank you for the great presentation. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you liked it. So yeah, I did. So when I was in high school, so I've been very, very fortunate in that I got involved with volunteering very early. So when I was in high school, I started something called the Brampton Multicultural Youth Council. And I started that because something existed in Toronto. So there was a Toronto Multicultural Youth Council. I was like, you know what, Brampton's so diverse. Why don't we have something like this in Brampton? So I literally just like messaged Toronto Multicultural Youth Council. I was like, hey, I would love to, would you consider coming to Brampton? And at the time, I was only finishing grade 9, so I never really thought of myself as someone who could start anything. But they were like, oh, we don't have anyone from Brampton. Do you want to start this? And I was like, I don't know how to do that. Will you help me? And they gave me some resources, and I had a Facebook page, and I got started. And then someone told me that Volunteer NBC was a really great organization. So I reached out to them and said, I'm this young person. I want to start this multicultural youth council. And they supported me in that. And we applied for a grant together on the United Way, ended up getting the grant. And that kind of jump started my initiative, and it still exists. So if you Google bnyc.ca, you'll find it. But I've just handed it off, so I'm no longer involved with that. And that's what I think also in terms of sustainability, when you self-organize or start a new initiative, it's okay to hand it off. One day your baby and / initiative will grow up and will have to leave and do something of its own, and that's okay too. But that can take time, and it's up to you to decide when it's ready for you to move on. And then last question is what do I aspire to do long-term career-wise? So I studied health sciences, and my long-term goal is actually to go into public health. So kind of be the people who deal with pandemics almost, at least on the background level. But to do that, I'm actually starting my medical degree this fall in September. So I'm really excited to spend another 4 years studying before going out into the real world. But yeah, that's where I'm at. And then Charmaine, I'm going to let you answer this question around how on earth did you get on the CBC?
Oh yeah, for sure. So when we were first starting the initiative, actually, our first media presence and how we got received a lot of volunteer interest was through local news. So I had a connection actually with a reporter who had covered some of the volunteer initiatives that I had participated in and led in high school. So she had seen, kind of the initiative circulating on Facebook. So after basically after we had, we were in the local news twice and we received a lot of volunteer interest. I know Eliza was like, oh man, what imagine how much interest we could generate by, getting in CBC or CBC Hamilton, like something even like, something bigger that can spread the word about our initiative and what our goals and what we're addressing, So she was like, okay, let's maybe reach out to CBC. So I guess there's a whole process to it. So my friend actually reached out to somebody who knows more about, contacting the news. And so I guess, so after kind of consulting with her connections, we created kind of like an email and just sent it to them and the email consisted of just what our initiative was, just some pictures, our progress, and why we're reaching out to them basically. And so we didn't get any response back, even though some of our volunteers also contacted the news for us. But actually one of our friends was being interviewed for his research with COVID, and he had suggested, why don't you check into my friends, both my friends, like their initiative. I think it would be something beneficial to, cover. So it's really, you can't really control it, unfortunately. Some things you can control because we did reach out to another local newspaper and they responded to us, but the CBC one, that really happened organically. Well, we tried to make it happen, but it ended up happening with it, like it was out of our hands. But our CTV news, that was something like, so basically what happened was after our article was published, CBC actually connected us with somebody from CBC Radio, and we ended up doing a syndication run. So that connection led to another one. And then also CTV heard us on the radio, which is why they reached out to us. So it's kind of like a domino effect almost. It's very hard to control, but we're so grateful. I'm sorry, that was a little bit rambly, but I hope that answered your question.
Great, thank you. I don't think any new questions came in.